I think getting to know you guys as an organization, like what is usually your kind of, do you hope to accomplish when you come in to consult with an organization? Do they set the goals, or do you guys kind of have recommended goals for them in terms of how you guys walk with them?
Yeah, so it's very simple because we have a 3-phase process. We sort of set the goals is before you can do anything. It's like counseling. It's like going to get your car done. Before you can say, hey, here's what I think I need. The mechanic actually has to say, here's actually what you need, or do an evaluation. So we do a diversity audit with every organization we typically work with. And what that audit is that we want to see the HR policies. We want to see the hiring processes, who are currently working in the organizations, what type of training, because this audit allows us to say, if you're trying to be an organization that's moving to be multicultural, multi-ethnic, here's some indicators you're going to have to work on. Here's some barriers you're going to struggle in. And so that's one of the things we like to say. We want to make sure that when we create a plan, that the plan is from the data that we receive. And so our typical organizations, we do that assessment, which then allows them to say, if you're going to create a 3-year plan, or even training for your organization around diversity inclusion, you're getting the information from your participants and your staff members. And so from there, we do a strategic plan with our organizations and develop a diversity task force. And what makes us a lot different is because, like you said, most people can't afford a full-time or even a part-time chief diversity officer to help them through this process. And so we're trying to create structure. That's why we create organization diversity task force. We help them develop a 3-year strategic plan, and then we support them into that process, which is the last phase we do, is walk alongside them, help them with training, help them develop HR policies, the correct hiring processes, help them market to the demographic that they're desiring. And so that's typically what we do over 1.5 to 2 years with our partners, is to give them some of those services. And after 2 to 3 years, they have their task force, the task force equipped, and the task force starts to lead it in the organization.
Okay, that's great. I'm just curious, what, like when I wrote the question, what is the big vision of the impacts? I would love to hear, when you think, hey, down the road, what kind of impact is CulturedEnuf and the services you're offering going to have on us culturally? And just, I would just love to hear what the big vision. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say Alyssa, please hop into it. I would say one of the biggest visions is that we really exist so that there's psychological safety in the organization, and that it actually is present. So here's what I mean. Most people would say, especially leaders, say, hey, we have a safe culture in our organization. And then response is, how do you know? We know that most people don't directly tell their supervisor how they're feeling, areas of growth and opportunity, especially minorities, women, and people of color. So every organization would say should do throughout the year, once a year, a diversity climate or a climate survey or evaluation, so they know where to grow. And so, Joe, to answer your question, one of the important things we like to understand is how do you know you're growing? How do you know you have psychological safety? And how do you keep staff? Keeping staff is very important, especially if you think about how much money and time investment you pay to onboard someone. And if you don't keep them after 4 to 5 years, you actually lose money. And so all of the effort we do with trying to hire diversity or try to hire quality staff, but we lose them in 2 to 3 years, is actually most of the time, if you look at the data, it's because most minorities or people don't feel psychologically safe. They don't feel like they're being developed and onboarded the correct way, and the leadership doesn't have a vision for them. So we want to make sure those things are in place. And so you can market and say, hey, we're the organization that values diversity, or we value all of our staff. We have an onboarding process. We have professional development, and we want to make sure all staff's voices are being validated, cared for, and supported in our organization. So that's what we do, which most of our organizations have found that being helpful, especially when you're recruiting and you're playing the recruiting game in higher education. Education nonprofit is what environment's the most healthiest. And that's what typically people will go to, and they'll partner with that organization.
Jael, can you just define a little bit psychological safety?
Yeah. So I love psychological safety because it's, especially when it comes to diversity and inclusion, is that psychological safety is very simple. It means that you're creating an environment that staff can speak up, they can share their thoughts, their suggestions without being demeaned, devalued, or frowned upon. And we assume that we just say, hey, there's a psychological safety, we have a safe environment. But what's interesting is that when you start to ask staff separately, if the environment is safe, can they share their insights? Can they address topics? If there's bullying, most of those environments happen, but we're just unconscious because we're used to it. We're part of the culture. And so why we like to mention that is because the research says if you have psychological safety, then your organization is more innovative. And if you're more innovative, that means you're being more productive and you're increasing your productivity, which means that you're going to have people speak up about different topics, even if it's a thing of saying, hey, in the last 3 weeks, there's something that happened regarding injustice in the U.S., especially with Black African-American communities. But if you don't create an environment where staff can speak up and say, as a CEO or organization, what should you put out? And this is something that me and Alyssa, we talk about. We've seen some of the most fascinating and horrible statements organizations have sent out because of lack of diversity on their team to say, hey, you shouldn't say that. Hey, what about this? Can we process this together? So you really have a lot of, and you're seeing this in the corporate world and even in churches, you have a lot of leaders not knowing what to say because they don't have teams around them that are diverse. But also, I think most leaders are not creating a safe environment where people can be very honest with them and say, hey, I see your intentions, but you need to add this too because people are going to perceive it this way too.
So, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, just to add to that and put it in context of where we are today in the country, is that currently the country is fighting a very real problem that has been going on for centuries. And to combat racism on a political level is also true to combat it in a societal level, but then also ministry level and corporate level. And so what we do as CulturedEnuf is we begin to evaluate, just like Jael said, and do an audit of where your company is or where your ministry is in terms of closing those gaps, of how people of color, of how both females and males can have equal opportunity within your organization or within your ministry. And so just to put it into all context is that to be able to look at the gaps that the ministry has or the organization has helps close the overarching problem within the country as well in terms of racism within the country.
That's great. And, I guess, so I'm going to say something that's oversimplifying it. I would love your feedback. It sounds like the process then is really intentional thinking about this with the right people and then really intentional communication that creates an open and safe environment. Is that, I know I'm oversimplifying it. But...
Joe, you're freezing. I don't know if everybody.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I thought that was me, but.
Yeah, he just froze out there.
Am I
Come
back?
on back, Joe. You're back now.
Okay.
Repeat what you said
Good.
because you got frozen there.
I said, I'm not going to oversimplify it, but I think that it sounds like you're creating a process for really intentional thinking about the issue of race with an organization, with the right people, and then really intentional communication about that creates opportunity for a great feedback environment, right? Am I oversimplifying that?
I'm glad you're bringing that word intention up, because if you can bring that up in the recording, that would be great, because we've spoken and worked with many, many Christian ministries and nonprofits that use intentionality to be able to create change within their workplace through relationships, through things, through prayer, through hearing someone's story. However, what CulturedEnuf does is we take it beyond intentionality, because everyone has good intentions, right? Everyone can have good intentions. Everyone can have good thoughts towards this thing. But we take it a step further and say, what strategies and what actions are you actually going to put in place to back up your intentionality? Because intentions only go so far.
That's great. Question about the proximity piece that you guys put in there. Was I right in assuming you mean like proximity in terms of location and, in terms of the groups you work with, the organizations you work with, things like that?
Yeah. So for us, and that's a part of our core value. We just believe if we're partnering, and even the language we talk about, like we say we partner instead of these are our clients. So the language is very intentional. It's like if you're an organization or a church or a nonprofit and you've never talked and dealt with, it's like counseling. It comes to a point where if you have an individual who has never talked about their broken or their baggage, they have to trust you. They have to genuinely believe that like you care for them, but also that you're there to help them. And you're not buddy, but you're sort of walking alongside them in this process. And so for us at CulturedEnuf, we believe, and we said this is great doing these things, but we meet our partners where they're at. We spend time with them. We go into their organizations because we want them to know that we already know they're uncomfortable having this conversation, and they need someone next to them to affirm and to remind them to keep going. And so proximity for us means that we're not at our desks. We don't like Zoom, so we're literally at our partners' organization. We're at their events. We're showing up. We're helping them through this process because that's how authentic change comes, is someone being proximate and interacting with them. And so that's just something that we've always valued as a diversity consultant.
Yeah, just to add to that, the power of proximity, right? So even if you have a CEO or a pastor that is congregating and having a ministry and just being in the organizer, their proximity to people of different diverse thoughts, their proximity, their personal proximity of who their friends are, of the people they hang out with, will kind of have a ripple effect of how they lead their ministry, of how they lead people. So the power of proximity is also based on your own microcosm of what you can control, and also the proximity of your organization. So I know Jael talked about strategy. So maybe what community service, or how are you getting into the community that is different from yours to have that power of proximity and that impact?
Yeah, that's really helpful. I was even thinking, and this might take us off topic, so we don't have to stay here too long, but I was even thinking in terms of, when I look at the overall picture culturally of what's going on, when you listen to the news, when you see everything happening, it's extremely overwhelming. And would you guys say the best place to start is just don't spend too much time on social media and all that stuff, but maybe focus more on the actual people you work with, the actual people in your neighborhood, the actual kind of community around you? Would you give that advice? I'm just curious, because I think when we get overwhelmed by how we're in such a global environment with all of the media we consume, it feels paralyzing for any issue.
Yeah, that's a great question, Joe. I was doing an interview for Lancaster Bible College, and it's funny because they asked the question. They said this. They said, "Well, what do you do if someone is not located around diversity? Should they talk about it?" And I think it's hard because I think there's diversity in a lot of places. We assume that's just race, there's gender, there's social economic. However, I would put it this way: you have to know what you're calling and what you should do as an organization. I don't expect a suburban church to maybe have the same practical convictions if they're not in that environment around people. I do expect them to know that, hey, this issue of ethnic superiority, ethnic division has been in the Bible all through Acts, and how the church is trying to figure out how to interact with Jews and Gentiles. And it hasn't went away if we look at the data. Church and Christian organizations are the most top 3 segregated institutions in the US. And so I think it's interesting sometimes where our partnerships, do we partner with diverse churches? Do we serve with interact? We assume that I have to be a church that is multicultural. No, that's not true. If that's not your calling of your church, I completely understand. Now, if you're telling me you want to be a church that's sharing and preaching about the gospel, I think it's hard to preach about the gospel and not talk about justice, biblical justice, the least of these, and widows, because it's mentioned 2,500 times in the Bible. And it also says in Micah, what does the Lord require of you? To do justice. So the question is, what does justice look like in your church? I can't tell you that. So if justice is loving your schools, if justice is going to international, that's great. But we do have to know that, hey, we have to do justice and walk humbly and love our neighbors. I think as Christians, I have found that we do an a la carte. We pick and choose what we want to address. And we're seeing the problem of that. Honestly, you're seeing the problem of hey, there's a group, especially African-American individuals, because the church, we pick and choose who we want to worship next to, that they don't feel like they're welcome. And so I would say if you're a church, especially white, I would say the bare minimum is that I do think with what's happening around the US, you should talk to your church about how do you lead this, and how do you be a Christian in your organization, in your community, and in your household. Those are things that, let's be honest, our organization might be diverse, or we might have to think about how do we have these conversations. We should be leading in this conversation and not watching from afar when it comes to healthy race reconciliation, which is biblical. That's like, you can't do reconciliation. If it's hard if you're not a Christian. I tell people, it's hard because I want to take my ball into my own court and not come back. But as a Black person, I'm called to love and forgive. So that means that I have to find a way to say, how do I love my white brothers and sisters who've hurt me? Because Jesus has come for the oppressed and the oppressor.
So good. I think I want to speak to social media really quickly. Social media can be overwhelming. Absolutely. I have had my days where I'm not getting on social media just because it is heavy. I mean, and every time you either see the videos of George Floyd or things of that nature, you get re-traumatized every time you're looking at those videos. So there's a healthy balance to seeing those things and exposing yourself to those things. However, when we refuse to not be a part of that, like Jael was saying, that's a form of privilege, right? Where we're able to kind of isolate ourselves from what is really going on in the country and in our communities. It's a privilege that we all have to be able to just shut everything down and to be in our own world, in our own bubble, and focus on that. So there's definitely a healthy balance to knowing the climate of your country, knowing the climate of the communities around you, and then also knowing when to take a step back as well.
Yeah, and can I echo that, Joe? I want to say something interesting because here's what I say. It is fascinating that we assume that race and what's happening is just a Black issue or topic. But I've had white, I mean, if you look around, most of these people at these protests are not actually Black. They're Asian, they're Native American, they're a big majority are white, millennials, younger people. And so this is what, and I said this, I don't know, I said this literally at Movement Day. I said, if our churches will not have the conversation about race, millennials will start to leave and not want to be a part because it's important to them. So I think that's even a conversation that most younger people coming up and saying, hey, I want to talk about justice and race. How do we do that well? And as a pastor, I think it's just being sensitive to say, know your congregation, be emotionally intelligent with the people you're leading. Don't assume that they don't want to have this conversation. If you don't know how to have it, know yourself and say, I don't know how to have it. I need to bring someone in. That's the beauty of counseling. I can't fix this myself. Let me go to someone who can help me do this. And I think even with this conversation, we do need to be honest is that it's not going to change anytime soon. And for us as leaders, especially in the church, we have to have pastors that are mostly competent and intelligent to say they don't know how to lead it and get help, or start to do some research so they can have these conversations, not just when we see lives are dying on the streets and then we have to rush to, let me call my friend of color to bail me out.
That's right.
Say more about that, Jael, because that last statement was charged. I could tell. Call my friend of color to bail me out. By the way, you're my friend of color who I literally just called to help me with this. So tell me more about that.
I'll tell you the difference. Joe, I'll tell you the difference. It's funny but we've been talking. Joe, you know me for how long?
Oh, how long has it been? 8-9 years?
8 years. And Joe, have we always talked about topics around diversity or just the structures of? Yeah. So that's what I mean. The difference is that you're calling me, but we have a past relationship where you're not calling me because we were intentional with each other and you create a space we can have this dialogue. What we have seen is CulturedEnuf. We've seen people come out the woodworks. Yeah. Say to me, I want you to think about this. One day I turned off my phone for 24 hours and I had over close to 100 and something text messages from people in one day. And most of those people were people I didn't have a relationship with intentionally, but I maybe have crossed paths with. And now they're telling me to open up my intimate experiences of being Black and share with them. That's not safe. I mean, let's be honest, I wouldn't feel safe as someone guiding and say, hey, let me talk to you. So I just want people to know, like, there's a difference when you reached out because I'm like, hey, Joe, we've always been talking about this for 8 years, 5 years, 3 years. I think it's actually not smart and healthy to reach out to someone you really don't know and say, hey, how are you doing? Just because when they're intimate with you, especially with this trauma, and you guys know as counselors, you don't know how to deal with that if you're not a counselor or someone who can walk through that. So they blur out how they're doing it, and then they tell you they're frustrated, and then your response, or most responses are like, oh, I'm sorry for that. It's not helping them. And so I just say that just because I think as leaders, we do have to take ownership. And that's why I say, I would love to see statements like this that we're starting to see from leaders. I don't know what to do. This is uncomfortable to have this conversation. I know we need to have it. What does it look like to move forward? and not to bail out, because I think it's insensitive, honestly. And I've told people like, hey, I just don't have the emotional capacity to deal with your trauma now and my trauma when we're trying to go through this. Like, find other people that you know of color. And if you don't know people of color, that's probably a spiritual sign that there's something going wrong if you can't have a close friend of color that you can dialogue with that wants to walk with you in that process.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm kind of going off script here, but do you feel like the way, you know, white people have engaged in this current kind of expression of, you know, protests and stuff, has it been unhelpful? Have there been things that have been very unhelpful about that?
I can't speak up about, so this one, there are different forms of how people need to use their platforms. I think some people can protest. If that's the platform they use, that's great. Some people use social media platforms, that's great. I'm more worried about in 3 weeks to 6 months, are we still using so example, you're using your platform to address a topic. My hope is that in the next year, like, it always becomes maybe a session of like, for a month, we're going to talk about race and cross-cultural interactions from a biblical perspective. And so I think what's fascinating, and I laugh, in the last 3 weeks, I found out I have all woke white friends. Like, all my white, on social media, it looks like I'm like, whoa, I didn't know they were all this way. This is interesting. Like 99% of all my white friends. And it's sort of interesting because I'm like, this is cute and this is great. But what are you actually going to do around your family and friends? What are you going to do in your organization? What are you going to do in your school district to challenge if teachers are being cross-culturally trained to have effective cross-cultural interaction? Like, that's one of the things where I'm just like, I appreciate the genuineness of reaching out and talking and saying it. But it's at a time, especially as Christians, that we have to know that this is nothing new to us. There's nothing new underneath the sun. So we have to have a different posture in how we go about living this out so that we can reflect and show God's glory in a broken world that's not doing it well. So I just think that we have to figure out what your platform is, and hopefully you stick with it and be consistent with it and not just stop when it hurts.
Yeah, I think, you know, part of the reason I've avoided social media lately is just how overwhelming it is, right? But also the other part is because I've actually found myself most angry with my white friends that want to act more woke than they are. This won't stay on the recording. I can't keep this on the recording, can I? I'm kidding. Anyway, yeah, I think I don't know why my personality is to not jump on bandwagons and to actually be critical of people who are, but, and that's probably not a good thing that I feel that way a lot of times, but, yeah, I get overwhelmed and worried by the fact that everybody's jumping on to something, acting more than they are to kind of justify themselves. Cause I think we all have that tendency, right? We want to kind of do that self-justification project of like, no, I'm good. It's everybody else who's not. And that upsets me more than anything else, honestly. And also social media does a really good job with all the way they collect data and then feed it back to you of keeping us in our own echo chambers. So it's insane, you know, what social media ends up turning into for people, because we just get fed by the data. What we look at and what we say, we get fed the views they think we want. And it's crazy. So
yeah, that's real. I feel like, I think, Jael, you have a lot of white woke friends. I'm all my white friends are just now learning and getting it. And so to that point, it takes a lot of grace on people who it took a couple of deaths to kind of realize what has been going on in this country for decades and centuries. So there's grace because with people have their separate journey in terms of trying to learn and figure out what this underlying theme is in this country. And so for me, it's taken a lot of conversations with Jesus to be able to kind of forgive people, or to be able to extend that grace, because now they're willing to learn, and now they understand why Black Lives Matter, and now they understand, you know, all the nuances that we have been talking about. So there's grace that has to be extended, of course, because we don't want to punish those who are just now getting it, but to extend grace and also be able to walk alongside them in a way as they are trying to learn and find the resources and hear the stories just now. So there's definitely a theme of grace with that. But I hear you 100% on that, Joe.
Well, I'll just say in response to what you said, I am deeply grateful that you are feeling that way, because I need a lot of grace too. So, yeah, so I'm curious what you'll say to this then. What do you guys feel like are the biggest obstacles right now to healthy race relationships in our country? What are some of the biggest obstacles?
Yeah, I think, simply one of the biggest obstacles is we have leaders that, and I put it all to leaders in some ways, in a lot of places, that haven't created environments where they can show some of their vulnerability and what they don't know to get help. Here's what I mean. I think when you're leading, when you're leading, Breonna Brown talks a great job about this. When you're leading, it actually sets you up where if you can't create an environment where people can see your honesty, vulnerability, and brokenness, it's hard for people to believe that you can make mistakes, and you rarely ever say you make a mistake up front. And so what I'm seeing more and more to do this well, I think we just have to have leaders to say, and when you say statements like this out loud, it actually takes the stress away from other people to say, okay, they said it, I agree, now I can sort of relax and don't have to be perfect. Yeah. I don't know how to talk about race. I grew up not talking about it. That's not a white issue. That's a people of color's issue too. Here's why. People of color grew up, if anything, most of them grew up talking about race out of fear. Don't talk to white people because this will happen. Don't do this. So that creates a trauma too, where when you talk about white people, you talk about it in a power, but then white people, you learn their parents most of the time raise them as, shh, don't say that. You can't do this. Hey, why does that black man, shh, don't say that. And it's like, no, that kid's trying to figure out and make this cognitive development to make some connections in their mind. And so I say that because one of the most vulnerable things a leader can do is say, I know this is important. I don't know how to talk about this. So let's go on this journey together.
Yeah.
Huge. We don't have leaders saying that. Even when they put out statements, we have leaders saying, I'm not an expert, but I know how to talk about this, or I'm going to say that we're going to move past this quick. And so, Joe, I think one of the biggest things is it comes from leaders. And I'll say this, leaders have to set the culture of the organization. And they have to keep it in front of people to say, hey, we're going to keep working on it. And it has to be a part of the DNA. Diversity might not ever be a part of certain organizations' DNA because of the location where they're at. But I think vulnerability and honesty and willing to listen and psychological safety should always be a part of that. Because when you start to bring in staff, especially when you start talking about uncomfortable topics, you're going to have a safe environment for people to make mistakes. And here's the sad part about it. We have not created, and people don't like when I say this, we have not created safe environments to allow white people to make mistakes, especially males. So if you do one thing wrong, you're losing your job, you're banished, and you're gone. I think that's even in the church, to be honest. You guys know about this. We have not created paths for reconciliation to say you made a mistake. Maybe you're not preaching for the next year, but you're going to do things to work back into this position. And I think we have to do that if we want to have white males, especially white people, in this conversation about cross-cultural interaction. You have to create that culture that we're learning and we're in this together, or people won't take a risk because they're scared of their job. They're scared that they'll be considered not liking other ethnic and racial groups just off of a small comment of like, oh, I didn't know that Black or Hispanic people prefer this, and now they feel like they're being attacked. So I think we just have to create that environment, which takes time, it takes vulnerability, and it's easier for me to say that as a Black person coming into a white organization because I'm Black and I see the importance of that, compared to if a white person said that, there could be some pushback of what does that look like? Why are you saying that? And so I think that's even having diverse teams around you to make sure that certain people are communicating certain things.
Yeah. Can I add to that really quickly? And I just want to put this out there, that especially when we think about the church and ministry wise, whether you're suburban, urban, whatever context you are at church, to really dig deep into the history of white supremacy in this country. Because if we're, as a church, universal, able to look at kind of our history and how the church has played a role throughout the last decades, it'll be easier to come to the point of, like Jael said, a kind of a remorse or lament or a repentance. But you can only come to that if you know the history of how the church has played a role in. And so if you even look at the country now and all the responses that even corporate companies are doing. If the NFL can apologize to Colin Kaepernick and have just a humility to be able to say, wow, we messed up and we put you in this box when actually this is what's really going on, then it behooves of the church to be able to kind of look at the role that was played within all the incidents. And all of this is Googleable. So you can Google anything church with slavery. There was actually, while there were African slaves, there were slave masters that actually gave slaves a Bible, or the slave master a Bible to preach from. And when they gave them the Bible, they ripped out all of the things that had to do with freedom. So they ripped out Exodus when the Israelites were free into the promised land. They ripped out all the New Testament words of freedom in Romans. So to tell someone, or to tell this person that you're not going anywhere, I'm using the Bible to tell you your property, and that you are owned by me, and this is all that you amount to. And so in looking back at that history, whatever your congregation looks like, it is a responsibility of pastors and preachers to be able to say, hey, this is this history that the church universal has played. So now looking back now, what can we do now to kind of reconcile what has been done in the past?
Yeah, and I would, just to add to that, I would say that the job of the church, and especially the pastor who's preaching, is to actually confront all things that are culturally wrong with the gospel, and so I think, in some sense, and I feel like the best motivator isn't guilt, but it's actually God's grace towards us, in how then we actually pursue how we see other people, how we see ourselves, and then how we actually pursue, forgive, love, repent, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But I would also say that, I think the church has both a terrible history when it comes to some of this, and there's lots that we could research and learn about that, and we should. And the church has an amazing history about how it has also been for the underprivileged, the poor, the widow, so I think we can do both, right? We can talk about the amazing history that we're part of and the terrible history we're part of, and apply the gospel to both, and remind ourselves what the mission of the church should be today.
That's good.
And it's that's
so,
all right.
Dave unmuted himself. Did you want to add anything?
No, that's okay.
Oh, okay.
I'm still listening.
Well, so let's talk about just the word privilege. I think, it's become a very specific term when it comes to white privilege right now. But let's talk about the role privilege plays. I've heard some great talks by Andy Crouch about just power, and what that means from a biblical perspective. How do you guys usually approach the topic of privilege? What is it as a man itself? What causes it? All that.
Well, it depends the environment we're in, because we work with secular and faith-based. I would say with faith-based, let's be honest, Jesus had privilege. He was fully man, but also fully God, and he came, and he wasn't a Gentile. And so I think sometimes we assume that privilege is I have privilege in some way. I'm educated, master's degree, run a business. I can work from home right now. I don't have to go outside. So sometimes we assume that it's only white people who have privilege. Now the question is, who has power historically? Who's been in situations where they control the narrative, which Brian Stevenson says a big thing about. And so I do think we have to realize when we look at power, how many CEOs out of Fortune 500 companies are of color? Less than 12. Out of 500, you're saying less than 12 CEOs are of color. Very interesting to me when you think of who's controlling the conversation, who's controlling the knowledge. How many theologians are of color that we understand that are have reputation in books, even though for a theologian at that time to be supported, you have to have someone right off to say you have good theology. And so the question of when I think of privilege, Joe, especially from a faith base, is we all have a privilege, but we do know this, because we're in a sinful environment, there's certain people who have privilege over other people. I think we do have to address that, and not to guilt, but to say, what do you do in this? I can't tell a white person how to lead in their organization. I would tell you, if you're a white person, that this is the best time to actually live out how to give up some of your power to show people how God works. I just think it's a beautiful time when I see white males say, okay, how do I hire diversity? How do I give other people voices and not always be up front? That's a hard thing to do, but I point back, if Jesus Christ could do it and leave things to the disciples to say the church is going to be on you, 12 disciples who have no clue, and I'm going to leave you with the Spirit. I think we can follow that posture to say, even if we don't have our ducks in a row and have to find the perfect person, it's all right. It's in God's hands. Like, it's not our church. This is not our ministry. I mean, this with CulturedEnuf, I tell people, like, I have to empower people who are younger than me or different than me, because I know this is God's ministry. And so I think there's one part you can have that conversation in not a guilt way, but understand, like, how are we going to use our privilege as a church, your location. There are great churches, Joe, like you mentioned, in the suburbs that have used their finances to glorify God. I'm thankful for that. And that's the truth. They have finances, so they do that. And on my secular, I tell people is that I just have a problem. I have a problem when I look around the room, if you're a diverse organization or you have all your diversity on a lower level and it's not in the top level leadership. I think that is one of the things where it's easy to keep our privilege in the secular organizations. But as Christians, we're called to be different. And so I think we sometimes have to separate ourselves and say, at this moment, we're not in the work environment. What do I need to do to empower, lift up, and to give a voice to people who ideally are marginalized groups?
And yeah, that's good. Privilege doesn't have to be bad. Like, it has, I'm thinking especially when we talk about white privilege, Jael, I'm glad you emphasized that we all have privilege. I have privilege to get off of my social media and to be in my own little world and not be affected at all by any of this, although there were stores burning down the street from my house. But other than that, I have the privilege to stay in my own little world. And I'm glad, Jael, that you're doing that, because we do need to change that narrative. It shouldn't be a topic of guilt, but of responsibility. So with my own privilege and with my own platform, what can I do to make the small change to get to what the goal is? And so privilege should not be something bad, but could be used for good, for sure.
Can I jump in and ask, or just make an observation? One of the things I wrestle with when I see all these woke people, right, on social media, and or when I hear conversations, the language is the same, but people mean different things. So, like, the way you're using privilege is different than the way Black Lives Matter. When I saw I saw them asking somebody to apologize, get on their knees and apologize for, quote, white privilege, right? It's a different term. The word inclusion is different. It depends on who uses it.
Yeah.
So it's almost like, how do you communicate and clearly communicate what you really mean? When we're using these same, quote, buzzwords or same terms that are susceptible to such different meaning.
Yeah, Dave, thank you for that honesty and vulnerability. What I teach in higher education, and what I love to do is the first day, I love to define terms.
Yeah, right.
So we're all on the same page. And I tell people, they're like, hey, when you speak about ethnicity, I say, here's what I mean by that. You might have your own definition, but when I say it, here's what I'm saying.
Right, exactly.
And I think that's the tension that they'll cut that out. And so I think we do have to know there are buzzwords. So, like inclusion. The question is, if you assume, you can say this, like, how you define inclusion looks different. If you're an organization, you don't want to add an LGBTQ, I'm not going to push back on you if that's how you want to define it. And then other people will say, hey, we want to address LGBTQ. I'm like, okay, but if we don't have the same language, and that's one of the problems, Dave, is that I think we're taking language and we're throwing it across the board and saying, this is the common language. And right. You know what? That's not true, because if you look at how race has been defined through history in the US, when it first started, there was not Asian, Latino, Hispanic. Pacific Islander. It's actually evolved over the years. And I think that's one of the things with some of the language we're going to use, even about privilege, is that we have to understand what it is and also articulate it well to people and then say, here's the definition I'm using. And I apologize if you don't agree with my definition. I'm just telling you, when I think of this word, I'm saying of this. And so here's how I'm trying to have the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
That's great. Oh, no, go ahead, Dave.
I'm just saying, and I agree with that. Like I teach ethical issues in counseling, and I always start out, what do we mean by ethics? What do we mean by morals? Right? Because there's such different meaning. You have the luxury of doing that. I have the luxury of doing that when I'm teaching.
Mm-hmm.
You don't necessarily have the luxury of doing that in pithy little statements.
Mm-hmm.
Or when you're reading somebody, so somebody gets up and says, I believe in X, and X means this. It's antithetical to the gospel, but yet if another person says, I believe in X, it's like, oh man, that's the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I would say, I think that's why we need to keep having grace on people. We need to assume the best. I mean, to be honest, we need to assume the best. And I've had people, that's it. When I try to create psychological safety, I've had people say inappropriate comments to me, and I just assume the best. I assume that they didn't mean it or that they don't understand it, and I'm still present. And I think that's, as Christians, that's the posture we have to have. Like, let's assume the best, even if they're saying a comment. And it's hard because in this day and age, like you just mentioned, Dave, we don't assume the best. We clump so much together and we don't have grace. And so it's hard to have this conversation in the sector. But as Christians, I'm going to say we have to assume the best. I have to assume that you're still my brothers and sisters in Christ. If you say something that offends me or I don't agree with, it's okay. There's other things we're going to disagree with. How do I still have interactions with you through this process?
Sure.
Can I ask an unfair question, and you can pick it apart? How much of privilege has to do with, or even just racial issues, has to do with skin color versus culture? And what I mean by that is, so one of my stories in my family is that my dad, 100% Italian, from an immigrant Italian family. My grandfather, my mom's side, asked her why she couldn't find a good white boy when she started dating my dad. That was his response. And culturally, back then, Italians were not white. I mean, but our skin color is white, right? So like, I think what's interesting about it is that, there is just truly cultural differences. I was talking to a friend who lived in Italy for a few years. He was like, the Italians hate each other. Different parts of Italy hate each other. So we were joking about how like hate's everywhere across all, lines. But I think in our country, there's some major cultural differences, but then there's also just the kind of face value of skin color matters in our country. Can you speak to that in terms of like, I know it probably intersects in most ways, but culture versus skin color?
Yeah, I'm gonna speak because this is what I get excited about when I get to teach. The U.S. is one of the only countries that how they understand race is embedded in, is embedded into the DNA. Here's what I mean by that. Understand the U.S. At a point, it had to be, they tried to enslave Native Americans to do the work. They didn't let people look like them do the work. And fast forward, you pulled a group of people, and now of their ethnic difference. And if you see some of the history of how we talk about even the names of people, we're looking at color. And so it's funny how like at a point you had Asian Americans not wanting to be Black and saying, hey, we want to be white, and trying to check the white box for the benefits of being not Black. And so I think when we understand history, all of the U.S. in some ways, and I'm all for the U.S., but I want to be honest. If we look at laws that are passed, if we look at redlining, if we look at education, if we look at hiring, most of that has to do with a color. As crazy as it sounds like, it has to do with skin color when you have the Italians making a choice to say, hey, you have to pick at some point if you're going to check the what box that we have, which is what? Italians, all this, Norwegians is in a box, white, Caucasian, compared to other. And so that becomes at a point where we make decisions off of that. We think about that. And so I do appreciate the culture. But what's fascinating, if you tell someone from international, if you take an African from international and put them in the U.S., the U.S. sees them as being Black. not African. When you see someone, it's how the U.S. we're embedded. We see, oh, that person's Black. And then they start talking. You're like, oh, you actually are from Britain. Interesting. But that takes time. We don't get to that point until you have to talk to someone, interact with someone.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the fascinating things that for us in the US, we do have to work through our history, which at least you said so briefly, our history, to know that we have to figure out why race, because race isn't a biblical term. Hear that? Race isn't a ethnicity, family, yes, you see that in the Bible, but race was not in the, they didn't look at people and say your color. They looked at like family origin, they looked at where you were from, and they clumped you together. Right. And I think that's one of the most important things is that, like, we don't, and when people say now, they be like, Jael, should we not talk about race? We have to talk about the reality of how something was built on. So I don't agree with it, but I do know we have systems in place on race. We have systems in place where you can look at someone and make a quick judgment and say, okay, this person's in this group. And that's one of the sad parts about the world that we live in, especially the US, is that it is a race-based society. Churches plant. I mean, you guys know this. I've talked to church pastors, and they get data about where they're planting at, and they look at the social, economic, and the racial group of how they're going to plant. Mm-hmm. They don't just say, I'm planting anywhere. I'm planting in Northern Liberties, East Falls. There's a specific group that they're planting to get. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm saying, like, even how we think of planting, we're making that decision, if we're honest, out of social economics, and on top of that, out of what group we want to get into our church.
Yeah, that's good. I want to add really quickly to that. The reason why, and I understand, Joe, what you're saying, is that in every culture, there's micro tension of where you, if you're born in the States or if you're from the actual country. So even as a Puerto Rican, there's tension between Afro-Latinos, and there's tension between Puerto Ricans that are lighter skinned that are from Spain. And there's tension between, you know, whether you're from the island or you're from the States. There will always be, to your point, to validate it, there will always be those microcultural tensions by far. Mm-hmm. But the reason in this country why the Black Lives Movement is so prominent is because your family's from Italy, my family's from Puerto Rico. They decided to come to this country for better opportunities, to better their own lives. However, African Americans from Africa were brought here for a whole completely different reason. And so even in that, in the way that as immigrants we come to this country, there is differences with the genealogy as well as the mental thought processes of an African American. How am I viewed Black in this country that they're constantly having to revisit? And even as a person of color, not Black, but as a person of color, I have benefited from even the civil rights movement, that in affirmative action and policies that have been placed for Black Americans to have, that now people of color can use as well. Mm-hmm. So to your point, yes, but also race, just to Jael's point, is that race plays such a huge role because, again, the history of it shows very, very different.
Yeah, that's really
and
helpful.
I would say last thing, if we didn't see race, we would have more church planters in the city. I mean, we would have more people planting in dense populated places that need the gospel. There's a reason why people don't want to plant in Northeast. Let's be honest, everyone wants to plant, if we're honest, and we want to plant in Fishtown, we want to plant in Center City, we want to plant in Mount Airy, we want to plant in places that are great, but I'm like, hey, if we don't see race, plant in the places that there's a lot of people at.
Jael, before Fishtown was a hipster's paradise, it was a little bit more diverse. That's
Right.
Can I ask a question about that? Because is it, and I'm really asking, do you think it's, people are saying, I don't want to plant in these places because people are Black there, or is it different than that? Is it skin color, or is it culture? Is it socioeconomic? What's the factor?
Yeah, I can't answer that because I think a part of it is a heart issue. And you know what I mean? I don't know. I don't know. However, I find it interesting if I've talked to a lot of church planters that come outside in, and I say, why are you planting in that environment? There's already 5 churches just like you. Literally, like young hipster churches, like nothing's wrong with it. Yeah. But I mean, Tim Keller says it. I don't think that we need another white church in the city. Like, do we need multi-ethnic churches? Yes. But my issue when I start to ask them questions, literally they're planting less about if God's calling them to the city and more what makes them feel comfortable in the city. So I look at that, Dave, and I say, I can't answer that question if you, that's a God question. However, I'm saying if we're about, I want to plant in the city and in places that are non-reach, then I think as a white person, it's like, hey, you can play the game like everyone else is playing, which is cool, or you can go to a place where literally there's so many people who don't know about God that would love to hear the gospel. Do I think the other churches in the city that are playing are white are great? Yes, I do. But what if we're honest, we're playing a hopping game. I'm going to this cool church. I'm going to this cool church. And it's sort of making this triangle instead of saying, are we actually making disciples? Like that's what Kaz talks about and Bill Christman, is that we're a church in Philadelphia. Most people are not going to most non-Christians are not going to church. They're hopping churches.
Yeah.
That's a problem to me if you have a city of 1.5 and most of the people don't go to church on Sundays, that we're just hopping churches to say intentionally, how am I choosing to plant a church? Now, I understand race, I understand good intentions and those things, Dave. However, I would have to say most of the reasons why we all choose to live somewhere or to go somewhere is off of our preference of what makes us feel comfortable and what we feel safe at. And as Christians, we have to ask God, is that what we're called to do? If it's called to be safe, then do it. But I don't think following Christ, anything's about being safe. I think we have to work on that tension. And there's no right or wrong answer. But I'm saying we do have to work on that tension because we're just in a city, and I'll say for Philadelphia, that we need more church planters that want to go where God says goes.
Yeah, we could go on this topic for a while. I'm very interested. Have you ever read the book Tribe by Sebastian Junger?
Yes.
Where he kind of gives an interesting mixed review about what it means to be part of, for lack of a better term, a tribe, and we culturally feel safe with the people we're the same as, and I would guess that, Liberty Center City, even if it wanted to be extremely diverse church, would always appeal to and reflect the leadership of that church. Does that make sense? Yeah. So if the leadership of that church is going to be kind of more intellectual, white educated people, then that's what that's going to attract, even if it's in the middle of the city, right? But, and Jael, you and I have talked about this, like if that's that church's core focus and mission, is it wrong? Because, white educated hipsters need to be reached too. But the question is, are we planting in all the other neighborhoods? And culturally, are we connecting across those borders, right?
Yes. So I wouldn't say it's wrong. Here's one. I think location is very important in calling. Everyone's not called to be a multi-ethnic church. Put it like that. Everyone wants to be said multi-ethnic. No. Like understand, it's hard. Like Peter was reaching a certain group of people. Paul was reaching the difference was when Peter forgot that, like, hey, those are still, even though you're reaching the Jews, don't get it twisted. You can't still be different around the Gentiles. And so even with churches, I tell them, I'm all right if you don't want to be multi-ethnic and multicultural, fair. However, if you're in Philadelphia, you know what I'm saying, if your location is in Philadelphia and you're not doing justice in a place that needs education, we need people that love God in the education, police department. I have a problem with that because that's not all. Philadelphia is a gritty city. Most people in Philadelphia, we assume Fairmount, Center City is Philadelphia. That's not Philadelphia. We're talking about the surrounding areas of Philadelphia where you have people who are struggling. I think as churches, every church in Philadelphia, and I can be biblically, I think every church in Philadelphia should say, if you're in Philadelphia, you should have a heart for the city and not just people in your congregation, the city, and care about the city issues too. That's what pastors anywhere in Philadelphia, I'm going to just say this. If you don't, you shouldn't be in Philadelphia because that's the city that you're in, a city that needs unity, a city that needs churches that are going to work together. And we don't have that. And that's one of my problems, that we don't have black, white, educated churches, non-educated, working together for the good of the city.
And to your point, I think yes, everyone needs Jesus. The people in suburbia need Jesus. The white hipsters need Jesus. Everyone needs Jesus. I think that's not the question at hand, but I do think that it's kind of easier probably to be able to plant a church where there's land, where you have more families than singles, where you're comfortable and the neighborhood And so I don't think we should guilt pastors for what they're called and where they're called to be. But for them to check check themselves, check the climate again of what the country's going through and the communities around them, and to be able to give them that outlet so they can reach out and they can be in close proximity with those different from them. So yes, everyone needs Jesus. The suburban churches are doing what they're called to do. And all we ask is for close proximity. And if you ever feel called to the city, then you definitely probably need to surround yourselves with people of that community if you're kind of going from one community to the next. To be strategic about it. If you don't, some kind of put pressure on pastors that you have to live in the community that your church is, that you're serving. There's different perspectives on that, but it is good to know, like Jael said, just the needs, basics. What are the needs? How can we serve wherever needed, and let that be the calling that God has.
So can I say something that I don't really mean, but it just sounds like too much work. It sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah. Hey, Joe,
I mean, isn't
that's real. That's
Absolutely.
what I'm saying. That's the theme of following Christ in a lot of ways, of like the sacrifice, not even a sacrifice, the sanctification. And that's what I'm saying. Most people are not called to multi-ethnic ministry in the church. I think counseling, we know, is work. People don't come to y'all saying, fix me, and you just fix, like, they have to do the work. And so that's the tough part about this conversation, is that when people say, wow, that's a lot, and they say, when you talk about diversity, you break all this stuff down. It's like, yeah, we do. And hopefully once you start to work out that muscle, it becomes natural. It becomes where you're not working so hard because you have a rhythm. And what's sad is that we just haven't done work when it comes to healthy cross-cultural interactions. I don't think we have done work in self-evaluating ourselves. And so it is work, but I guarantee you, if you do it for a while, if you keep going to a counselor for a while, you start to realize the things you need to work on, so you're not working on the same stuff 2 years down the line.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, let me jump to a question. Yeah. From our list here, what are the most common ways that people discriminate, marginalize, and express racism without even knowing it?
Ooh, that's good.
Great question.
I'll write a book and you can buy it. That's a good.
Yeah, you got to write that book, okay?
Yeah. Alyssa, you want to go first? Because I know, like, I know the top literally.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are definitely called microaggressions that can happen in the workplace, in ministry, in church. Definitely when people have implicit bias, they are acting in a behavior where they have favorites or they do not have favorites, and they seem to not be aware because that's just all that they've done and all that they've known. So when you have, people of color may be paying less, or when you are booking flights for your team to go to a conference, and sometimes the people of color have to take, the one with the layaway, the layover. So it's like those implicit things can come up, and sometimes they're checked at the door when a person of color brings it to someone's attention. And so that happens all the time in workplaces, in environments. Also, to the flip side, right, of when you're a white leader trying to celebrate culture, that can go also in a different direction. When you're trying to celebrate Black History Month, when you're trying to celebrate maybe Cinco de Mayo or something like that, when you are trying to do that out of good intention, when you want to have a gospel choir for Easter, but you don't even play gospel music, when you want to have that one Black worship leader singing that song and doing the little riff, all those things come out of a genuine, I want to celebrate a culture heart. But when it's not checked with those people who are in that culture, it can go wrong very quickly.
When you say when it's not checked with those people,
yeah.
What do you mean by that?
That's a great question. When you are, say, every pastor does this, they plan their meetings, they plan their holidays, or they plan, how are we going to celebrate this, right? Who's at the table, who has a seat at the table that you bounce ideas off of, and they can say, as a Black person or as a Latina, I don't really think that's going to go well. Maybe we can do this instead. I see your heart, pastor, but that's, you know, wearing sombreros and bringing out taquitos during church, it's a little bit over the top. Let's try to do this instead. So that's what I mean by checked, and thank you for clarifying, is again, it's in terms of inclusivity, right? Who is included in making these decisions so that the pastor, when he is putting this on, can be well informed as to what his goal is and what he's trying to accomplish. So those are just a little bit examples of the church and workplace.
Perfect. Can I give practical? And I'll speak on the church. We can go, I can tell you about church things that happen in secular. Secular, it's interesting even how we do the hiring process. So literally clearness of, like, if you hire off of a friendship, off of someone, and you have different questions you ask, or you do an informal compared to a non-formal, that actually is a form of bias, and you're making a favoritism. I don't even have to say racist, but you're showing favoritism through someone, giving them an extra or a quicker pass through. And it's fascinating for us to see organizations, even promotions. I used to work for an organization where it was it's not what you did, it was who you knew. Mm-hmm. So if you interact with your supervisor, if you went golfing, now you're golfing. What happens when you start to golf? You start to talk about stuff. You start to interact. You start to say, oh, well, this is a position to open up. Oh, that is? I think I'll be a good. So it's so fascinating with some of these promotions people have received that we've studied have been off of just out of the organizational structure. So if I'm a person of color and I don't want to go to the extracurricular activity, the barbecue, I might now have to say, I have to go to the barbecue because that's where deals get made. That's where people can ask me questions. I can see the new job openings. That's where some practical. In the church, it's so funny how it goes. Churches sometimes have more obstacles. They have more obstacles to be in leadership than corporate 500 companies have. Here's what I mean by that. Churches, they don't say it, but when you start to say the simple question, what does it mean? What do I need to do to be in leadership? Most churches can't even articulate that. Really, they don't know what to do. So they're like, well, you come to church. You do, but like, what do I actually need to do? Do I need to start doing Bible studies? How many hours? Because if you have that outline, it tells people that we have a process, and it's not just who I like, who I hang out with, who's going to be an elder. Well, the elder, what does it mean to be an elder? And I have to walk through churches of, like, sometimes we write things down, but then when someone does those things, we say, but then they have to do this too. And what I love about higher education is that, you know this, Dave, they tell you that you can't change the paragraph, and you can't change the student learning outcomes. Everything else you have control over. The books you use, what assignments you give them. Churches, I've seen them sort of say, hey, if the goal is to have someone be an elder, what do they need to do at the end? Like, what books they need to read. Now, how they get there, they should be able to do that any racially and ethnic way, but sometimes we assume that, and so we have structures in place where we say, well, you know what, you didn't do this. And I say, well, you didn't tell this person to do that before. Is it written down? Are you articulating up front? I think it's always articulated up front to say, hey, we're looking for elders, or we're looking for people to be in a worship band. Here's what we mean by that. Not just say, because we've had people try out for the worship band, and then they're not on the band, and here's what they basically are told. Hey, your style of worship wasn't really what we're looking at. You don't know how to stay in tune. And I'm like, but you didn't mention that before. Like, you just added that in now because they bring a different flair. And I think that's where you start to see some of the policies that we have in structures that are not just clear across the line, and that you start to show favoritism. And that happens naturally in not just white circles, a lot of circles. The difference is that I think data has shown it happens a lot to women and people of color in primarily white spaces, just because of their upper mobility, and they don't have these interactions they have with their male counterparts.
So really, we have to be really wise and smart about our cultural biases, our racial biases, and the way to do that is actually to start to expose ourselves to these kind of questions, be vulnerable around them, right?
Absolutely.
And it protects your business. I mean, like, I think it's very helpful. I think it shows the integrity of the church. You don't have to have all the answers. I think it's always fair to help people understand how to get to something in a leadership role or lead a small group. I think it's just helpful for them to say, so when you tell them they're not leading a small group, you can give them reasons why, and not pull stuff that are personal, and not actually when it comes to, like, the traits of what a small group leader should have. Competencies is the best way. Have 5 competencies that you're looking for, and make sure that you articulate those competencies so you're hiring people for those competencies.
So here's my question. Is it possible to then try to really, with the right people helping you think through it, take your core values and kind of maybe remove some of the cultural biases out of them? Or is it true that a lot of core values that companies have, they're not necessarily inherently culturally biased or racially biased, but it's how it's how they play out and how they're lived out that becomes bias, right?
Yes. So typically what we like to tell organizations, everyone has core values. And then the values you gotta have, underneath those values, you gotta have competencies. What makes those values and then the behaviors. You should at least have 3 behaviors to affirm those competencies, and that's what you're looking for, instead of saying, we don't know the behaviors. So it's very simple. If you have a behavior of proximity, what is proximity to your organization? What are the competencies of someone being proximate to someone? And then what are the behaviors? So I've had to call out staff and they're saying, hey, your behaviors are not aligning with the competencies. You're at home taking Zoom meetings and COVID-19 hasn't happened yet. The competencies of proximity is showing up, going where people are at. You need to be 75% of the time in environments and not at your house. So that actually helps me have a tough conversation compared to me not explaining it. And now I'm having to have a conversation. They might say, well, is it because I'm a white male? Or is it because I'm a person of color? Or is it because I'm a woman? No, it's because you didn't do the behaviors and the competencies that we talked about. So that's what it's about. And so I think we just have to be clearer, because my bias, if I'm honest, is to interact with people who act and look like me, Joe. So I'll give grace more to people who I like.
Yes, we all will, right? Yeah, so, it's funny. We do a lot of work. I don't know how familiar you guys are with Pete Scazzaro and the emotionally healthy discipleship material. We do a lot of work with that. And a lot of that material actually, I feel like a lot of the tools that he has and stuff like that do offer great tools to actually have these kind of conversations. So since we're getting past our time here, I just want to move us forward to like practical things. Are there good resources? Like, we find that to be a great resource that across a lot of issues, whether it's racial, any sort of relational issue that comes up, it brings a lot of helpful tools into intentionally creating a culture where there is transparency, there is vulnerability, where there can be a lot of honesty and good communication about things that often get miscommunicated and people get hurt by. So, and especially I think a lot of those tools have to do with how leaders lead people when it comes to even that feedback loop like you're talking about. So what other tools are out there for people that you think are really helpful?
Yeah, so the first tool, go ahead.
Can I just say 2 books that I highly recommend for pastors and leaders is Right Color, Wrong Culture by Brian Loritz. It is an easy read, but it is so profound in how they kind of navigate how to find the right fit for a certain congregation and for a goal that they're trying to migrate and trying to have a multicultural congregation in Tennessee, I believe it is. So Right Color, Wrong Culture by Brian Loritz, and then The Advantage by Patrick Lencioni. It is incredible because what he does is he talks about what does it look like to have a healthy, how to set a healthy culture within your organization, within your nonprofit, that you can definitely apply to your church. And it talks about, also emphasizes the leadership and vulnerability. So how powerful it is to be in leadership, but also lead from a stance of vulnerability and honesty as well. So 2 books, that's what I recommend.
Patrick Lencioni, or however we pronounce his last name, he's written a lot of leadership books. I feel like I've read a couple, right?
He's incredible.
Yeah.
By far incredible. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, my only add to that would be Dare to Lead. First is CulturedEnuf. If you have the opportunity, I'm going to be honest, I think getting professionals helping you in that. However, I think some of the great things like Right Race, Wrong Culture by Brian Stevenson, Brene Brown, Dare to Lead, I think she just does a great job in setting the page. And then also, I mean, Harvard, and this is my business, Harvard Business Review has great studies, research-based about cross-cultural interactions and just empathy, psychological safety. Even they had one that was so greatly put. They said it was literally how to lead in a crisis. And what was interesting, 3 of the things that they mentioned out of 5 were things that I wish leaders would have done when they saw the injustice in the last 3 weeks of Black African American people. It's almost like being aware, addressing it, not acting like it doesn't exist. And then also, like, those are normal human, this is what I'm saying, Joe, it's so interesting. If we did the normal human things of just leading, we wouldn't have to even talk about having a cultured enough, it would just be, as a leader, I'm doing the right things with all people around me. And that's the sad thing about it. We're quick for COVID-19. We changed everything up, but we're less quick to address the issue, like the injustice that happened to Black people for the last 3 weeks when it comes to shoot. So that's one of the things I say as leaders is like, I don't want to say just find Black people to talk to or minorities. Lead consistent, please. Just lead consistent in your churches. Lead consistent, and it might be different with how you do it, but you should be able to lead consistent so people can say, my leader is caring for everyone the exact same way, even though it looks different. He still is caring for men, women, different ethnic cultural groups the exact same way.
Yeah, and would this be a good statement too? Even if you don't know how to lead, first of all, get the right resources, but don't be paralyzed by it.
Yes.
Very good. Very good.
I even listen to JL to your live Instagram thing. I think one day you did one day it was like, you didn't make a statement, you got to make a statement. And the next one was like, yo, here's all the wrong ways people made statements. And I listened to it. It was great. But I was also like, oh man, I'm scared to do either now.
That's honest.
Yes. But so I would say this, Joe, and this is the beautiful thing, and I've been to counseling. I still go to counseling. Me and my wife are going to counseling. The hardest part about counseling is the first time going. I would say the hardest thing is to actually you have to admit, but to actually step into that and sit and to talk to someone. And that's all right. I mean, you guys say it. It's all right that it was hard for them to get there. And I think we forget that, yes, we might be paralyzed and we might stop. But if we just keep going just a little bit, take the small steps, it starts to get more and more comfortable. I love going to my counselor. Me and my wife, we still go to our counselor for our marriage individually. But the first time was the hardest time because that made me have to be vulnerable and honest, and it got easier through the years.
That's good.
I do think that the fear is when you step out and you make that first, attempt or whatever, that you get attacked. You get attacked by people who don't understand your motives,
right.
Or you get attacked because you didn't say it right, you didn't do it right, and that is paralyzing.
Yeah, absolutely. And to equate, and I wanted to add to Joe, is paralysis can also lead to silence, and that's why a lot of leaders are not making a statement because they are so scared to do so that their silence then becomes also attacked. So it's like either you do or you don't.
Yeah.
But the fact of that is a honest and real burden of leadership. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
When Jesus was doing his ministry, he had to make hard decisions. He made a decision to speak to the Samaritan. He made a decision to overturn the tables in the temple. He made a decision to put himself out there and put himself on the cross when he didn't have to. He was a leader and he made very, very hard decisions. And he was given the utmost backlash by being crucified. So the burden of leadership is very real. And that's why you do have tools and the resources that we mentioned, and also companies like CulturedEnuf that can help walk alongside you. Fine tooth comb the statement that you want to put out. And yes, it is very real burden to carry, but it comes with the entire package. And it comes with seeing reconciliation in your organization. It comes with seeing healing in your leadership and in your relationship. So although very real burden right now, you will reap what you sow. And when you put yourself out there and kind of make that bold statement that is true and you are convicted by, when you see injustices, God will reward that, and he will follow you through with it, and he will protect you and he will provide for you. And guess what? The people who want to leave, they can leave.
Yeah, I do want to echo that, Dave, because there is a sense, and here's what we found out. The people who put out statements, and these are even some of our partners that we work with. It's funny, they put out statements and I'm like, you should have just asked us. We would have told. So even that of like, if you have people around you, diverse people around you, and this thing, most leaders I've seen, even myself, I found myself, I've made the biggest mistakes when I've done things without consulting with my team. And I have a diverse team. And I think leaders, and we've had to deal with this, are like, we tell our partners, we're here to help you out. You shouldn't have put this, before you send this statement, we should have had a conversation so we can say, prepare yourself, because you might get pushback on this. Okay, let's go. Because I think we have to talk through those things. And what happens is that sometimes we have leaders that sometimes feel like they have to do that all by themselves. And I don't think that's healthy as any leader to take that burden. So that's why it's important to have a diverse team around you, or to even tell your team, we're putting out this statement. I need you to be honest. What are some things we have to prepare for as an organization? Okay, let's talk about that. Instead of just putting out a statement in isolation, I just feel like that's what we've seen, is that it's been a lot of isolation when people have done statements and addressing topics, and rarely doing it where you're bringing in your team to say, let's think about this, to spend half of a day talking about this, because we know if we send it out, it's going to take probably a whole 2 weeks to fix it after you send a statement. So.
Well, thank you so much. I wish we could keep talking, but I want to respect your time. Really appreciate taking the time to do this. Yeah, thanks. We're gonna take this, and we're gonna probably work more of an article out of it that has like some of the questions, answers, and stuff like that. And then we're gonna put together some resources too. So, you know, I might circle back around to you guys too, in terms of other resources and things like that too. But thank you so much.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. Very helpful. Really
Yeah,
Of course,
really
thank y'all. Hey, can I pray for y'all in the ministry you're doing? Just pray, because I mean, like you said, the groups that you're reaching, and how this is a question, and I appreciate that this is a step towards, is an organization to say, hey, how do we support and provide resources and tools? So I want to pray for y'all, because you're in the front lines doing the hard. You're essential workers right now, and so I think always you've been essential workers, but right now I think there's so much of this crisis where people need the services that you provide. So I would love to pray for you too.
Yeah.
Dear God, we come to you being thankful for each individual person on this call and the servant leaders ministry, and how it's evident that you have something past maybe even what they know that you want to do, especially when you think of COVID-19, the racial, ethnic, and cultural divide that we're seeing, and how churches are trying to figure out how to be healthy in a time where they have to be remote. They have to do things online. And so, Father, I just ask that you give each individual person on this call, and then also the new hires that has happened in the last week, I think I saw, that you give the hires and the team the ability to care and listen to each other, to love, and to walk alongside each other and live out what they're doing to reflect how much you love them and your love for us. God, we don't take it lightly that you positioned these types of organizations to make an impact in the church, and more importantly in the lives of individuals. And so we ask for favor. We pray that you give them and keep allowing them to have uncomfortable, bold conversations with their followers and their listeners. And God, I ask that Philadelphia can be blessed in new ways with this type of ministry. And I've said this many times with Joe and Dave, especially in the African-American and Latinx Hispanic church, that there are a lot of people who just need and don't maybe have the opportunities of getting counseling and help, and to work with the trauma and work through things that have caused them to live in generational sins or generational bondage. So, Father, we pray that you open up doors so that all across the city and around the city, and even in the suburbs, that there'll be a revival when it comes to people desiring counseling, desiring help. So we pray this in your son's name, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll be in touch.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.